Good evening, friends. Tonight, we're stepping quietly into the world of soot, heat, and glowing furnaces. A time when fire never truly died out, because if it did, the entire operation would collapse. So, go ahead, dim your lights, settle under your blanket, and let's drift slowly into the medieval past. And if this quiet little journey helps you unwind, feel free to tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. Let's begin. Imagine a small village tucked deep in the forested lowlands of what we now call northern France. The year is 1243. The scent of pine hangs thick in the morning mist. But deeper in the woods, another smell rises, sharp, bitter, earthy, the scent of burning ash and molten minerals. That's where the glassmakers live, unlike the bustling heart of the village. These artisans work on the fringes, not just physically, but socially. Fire was dangerous, after all. The kilns they stoked could easily become the source of disaster if mishandled. Their furnaces were kept burning day and night. And the villagers, perhaps wisely, preferred a little distance. Inside one such workshop, a long, timbered structure, half open to the air, the temperature hovers unbearably close to 40 degrees Celsius, even before dawn. In the center, a great clay furnace glows like an orange eye, its interior so hot that it could turn quartz into liquid. This is where Jean, an experienced Martin-Verrier, begins his day. Jean is in his early 40s, old by the standards of his trade. Years of inhaling fumes and working in sweltering heat have left his skin leathered, and his hair long faded from its original color. His hands are gnarled, fingers forever dusted with a fine white grit, the mix of sand, potash, and ash that will become glass. Apprentices scurry around him, teenagers mostly, dressed in woolen tunics, some barefoot, others wearing leather, soles worn smooth by soot. They carry long metal rods, their ends glowing with soft, honey-colored blobs of molten glass. The rods spin slowly, rhythmically, to keep the forming shapes from collapsing under their own weight. Jean inspects each piece, rarely saying more than a nod or grunt. Praise is sparse here, but every movement is deliberate. There's little room for flair. This is not the Venice of colored marvels. Not yet. It's France, and these are workmen, not artists. The raw ingredients sit in wooden bins at the back of the workshop. Sand, the base. Ashes, usually from beechwood, sometimes fern. And then the secret ingredient, at least here, animal bones, crushed and burned until they become a white powder. This combination lowers the melting point of the sand and gives the final product a faint, greenish hue. As Jean mixes the batch for the next melt, he pauses to sniff the air, an instinctive act. It's too much ash, and the glass becomes too bubbly. Too much sand, and it won't melt in time. The balance must be exact, though they have no thermometers or scientific scales. Only memory, trial. In the smell of hot mineral smoke, the apprentices murmur among themselves about a broken crucible from the night before. Jean doesn't interrupt. That crucible will have to be patched with river clay if the fire holds. The real work begins once the glass is molten. Using blowpipes, the workers roll the red-hot material onto a smooth stone surface, known as a marver, shaping it slowly into spheres or cylinders. Then they blow, gently, expertly, turning breath into form. Every breath matters. It's too much, and it bursts. It's too little, and it collapses. One of the boys, Etienne, barely 15, is clumsy today. His glass bulbs slumps like porridge. Jean sighs and gestures for him to reheat it and try again. They'll lose that piece. No choice. Lunch, when it comes, is a quiet affair. Cheese, hard bread, and warm beer served near the furnace. They cannot let it die down. The coals must be fed constantly, even when no glass is being shaped. But the real fascination comes in watching the glass cool. Sheets of flattened, crown-blown panes are laid out on iron frames to settle. Slowly, the color changes, faint green, sometimes pale yellow. Impurities from the ash and bones give it life, and no two batches are quite the same. In time, these sheets will be cut with red-hot irons and carefully scored for use in monastery windows. Not cathedrals, not yet. This is peasant glass, functional, strong, slightly cloudy, meant to keep out wind and rain, not inspire devotion. Still, in the glow of the firelight, there is a strange beauty in it. The greenish ripple, the way light filters through, bending slightly, like water. Jean pauses, looking at a finished pane, with something close to reverence. Even in these simple creations, there's a kind of alchemy. It's an order to the chaos of heat and time. Outside, dusk begins to fall, but the workshop glows ever brighter. Another load of sand is ready, and Jean's eldest apprentice, Luke, will oversee the night shift. The boy is quiet, precise. Jean believes he may one day run this place if the fire holds, and if no one gets careless. And, in a strange way, his life, so blistering, so monotonous, is a form of survival, not just for the men, but for the knowledge of the sacred balance of ash and sand and sweat. Because if this furnace ever went cold, who would remember the recipe? Who would keep the fire burning? Luke, the eldest apprentice, stayed behind while Jean retired to a small wooden hut just beyond the workshops. Sleep, for glassmakers, was always light and segmented. They rested in cycles, always aware of the fire's needs. A slight drop in temperature and an entire batch of glass could turn to brittle waste. Luke had his own way of watching the furnace. It didn't poke and prod the coals as Jean did. He watched the flame's behavior, how it moved inside the dome, whether it flickered unevenly or leaned too far to one side. Over time, he had learned to read fire the way others read handwriting. He wasn't alone during the shift. Two younger apprentices, the twins, Bernard and Corentin, barely 13, stayed to assist. They were fast learners, but still fidgeted when nervous, especially Corentin, who had the habit of tapping his iron rod against his foot. Luke would shoot him a look, and he'd stop briefly. Tonight, they were tasked with preparing the batch, the raw mix of silica, ash, and additives that would go into the crucible at dawn. It was dirty, repetitive work. The boys took turns sifting the fine sand through a stretched cloth, ensuring no large particles remained. They used long-handled wooden spoons to stir ash into the mixture, grinding any clumps into fine powder with small stones. The workshop air was thick with it, a light, chalky fog that settled in the lungs. Some men developed what they called furnace cough, a low, grating rattle that came with years in the trade. Jean had it. His old master had it before him. Luke wondered whether he too would develop it in time. Occasionally, sparks jumped from the firebox. Luke would knock them down with a flat paddle, eyes sharp. His furnace walls were made of hard clay and brick, coated with a rough whitewash to reflect the heat inward. That time wore them thin, and a crack in the wrong spot could spell disaster. Heat never abated, not even in winter. The next morning, Jean returned before the sun cleared the treetops. He always did. Luke reported that the fire had held steady. The coals were bright, and the batch was prepared. Jean nodded once and got to work, his motions silent and practiced. His mind, however, was not entirely on the glass. Word had come the previous week that a master from Paris might be traveling through the region. A royal glazier, some claimed, or at least someone commissioned by a bishop. Jean didn't believe rumors, but he was still uneasy. If such a man arrived and requested a tour, or worse, samples, they would be judged, compared, found lacking, perhaps. His glass was strong, reliable, but not decorative, not like the pieces coming from Venice or the stained glass workshops of Chartres. His windows were for barns, for taverns, for minor chapels. There was no silver stain in his technique, no enamel painting, just ash, sand, and sweat. Still, he doubled the apprentices' training sessions that week. They began shaping thicker sheets, practicing uniformity. Jean insisted they measure paint sizes against a wooden stencil, even though most customers didn't care about exact dimensions. Consistency, he told them, is the only art we can afford. One afternoon, the workshop was visited, not by a royal master, but by a friar. He was young, thin, and dust-covered from the road, wearing a plain brown robe and carrying a travel satchel that hung heavily at his side. His name was Brother Arnold, and he introduced himself with a bow, though his eyes were already scanning the workshop with quiet interest. "I've been tasked," he said, "with assessing artisans for potential service at Saint Benut-sur-Loire. Our abbey seeks new window panes for its cloisters." Jean didn't answer immediately. He looked at the man's boots worn. Yes, but sturdy. This friar had traveled far, not a royal envoy, but official enough, and certainly not here by accident. "Do you need colored glass?" Jean asked finally. Brother Arnoul smiled faintly. "We seek durability first, clarity second. Decoration is a matter for later days." That was something Jean could deliver. He invited the friar to sit and observe the next shaping session. Luke and Etienne demonstrated, the younger boy managing not to drop the blowpipe this time. Mend. Jean himself flattened a roundel into a sheet before the friar's eyes. Brother Arnold leaned close to inspect it as it cooled, careful not to inhale the steam rising from the surface. "Not clear," he noted, "but uniform. No bubbles. That's rare." Jean shrugged. "It's in the ash. Most burn too hot." Arnold nodded. "It's clean, and the glass grows weak." It was a quiet, nerdish moment of mutual understanding. Jean allowed himself a small smirk. Before leaving, the friar handed Jean a letter sealed with wax. It was not an order, but a formal invitation to submit samples, a rare opportunity. If accepted, it could mean months of work, prestige, reputation. That night, Jean said nothing of the letter to the apprentices. He simply sat by the fire, stirring coals longer than usual, watching the flame dance against the crucible, dreaming, perhaps, of a time when people will look at his glass and see more than just something to keep the wind out. Over the next few days, the workshop shifted into quiet overdrive. Jean selected the best sand from the recent delivery, cleaned the crucibles twice, and remixed the ash with fern fronds instead of bone, believing it might yield a clearer hue. He also let the apprentices attempt decoration, basic tooling, with iron rods to create patterns in the glass while it was still soft. He didn't expect them to succeed. That wasn't the point. They needed to know what it took to fail artfully one evening. Etienne came close, creating a slight, symmetrical swirl in the center of a pane. It was faint, nearly invisible unless the light caught it at the right angle. Jean said nothing, but set the pane aside. Not for sale, not for the friar, just aside. He would study it later. The sample batch for Saint Benut was ready by week's end. 6 panes, uniform in thickness, cut to monastery standards. No flaws, no bubbles. The glass had a faint green tinge, not beautiful, but strong. Jean sealed them in straw-lined boxes and handed them to a courier traveling south. Then they waited. Waiting, in a workshop like this, is hard. There are no days off. The furnace must burn. Orders must be filled. Time is marked not by hours, but by the state of the fire and the color of the glass. Apprentices came and went. Deliveries arrived, but always the question loomed, would Saint Benut respond? When the answer came 2 months later, it was not what Jean expected. A different friar arrived, older this time, with a leaner face and sharper tone. He introduced himself as Brother Gervais and handed Jean a second letter, a tease. One bore a new seal, The abbey had accepted the pains, but they wanted more, twice the amount. And this time, they requested a warmer tint, something closer to amber, for the infirmary wing, apparently, where the light should feel gentle and safe. Jean's brow furrowed. He didn't have a recipe for amber. He had green. He had yellowish gray. But amber, that would require metal oxides, possibly copper shavings. He had never tried it. Still, he didn't say no. Instead, he looked at Luke, then at the furnace, then at the bins of ash. We'll find a way. The next morning, Jean began experimenting. Small batches, minute changes in ash ratios. He tried copper filings, crushed rusted nails, even dried onion skins burned into powder. The smell was terrible. The results were inconsistent. But on the 5th day, something changed. A pane came out with a soft, honey gold hue, just enough to warm the light without darkening it. Jean stared at it for a long time, turning it in the daylight, watching the shadows play across its ripples. He said nothing, just set it down. Luke approached from behind, curious. Did it work? Jean only nodded once. Then, for the first time in weeks, he smiled. And yet, for all the fire and sweat, Jean knew something odd, that no matter how perfect the glass, how subtle the tint, no one would remember who made it. There would be no signature, no mark, no fame dot, only panes in a wall, catching light, windows through which others would look, not at the glass, but beyond it. But what makes a craftsman continue when his work is meant to be invisible? The amber glass was packed carefully, 6 new panes, honey-colored and lightly dappled, just as requested. When light filtered through them, the shadows on the walls resembled soft candlelight, a perfect comfort for the infirm. Jean had never made anything quite like it, and yet, even now, he didn't let the apprentices celebrate. No clapping, no boasting, I simply returned to work. That was the rule in glassmaking. Praise cools slower than glass. Still, something had shifted. There was a new energy in the air. Apprentices were more careful with measurements. Kian stopped dropping the blowpipe as often. Kevin Corrent had gone a full week without burning his sleeve. And Jean, for the first time in years, was experimenting again. He tested new ashes, grapevine, straw, even burnt fish bones which, to everyone's dismay, smelled terrible. He tested clay pots of different thicknesses. He allowed Luke to try, shaping his own free-form panes. Some were ugly, most were unusable, but the furnace kept burning. One evening, Jean sat alone beside it after the apprentices had gone. A thin drizzle tapped the roof. The fire crackled, sending brief sparks upward into the chimney. He held a small pane of failed glass. It had a deep purplish hue, almost black, caused by a mistake in the metal content. It was useless for windows, but it was beautiful. He turned it slowly, watching the firelight dance through its imperfections. No one would buy it. No church would want it. But for a moment, Jean thought about keeping it, not for function, not for sale, just to remind himself that not all beauty needs approval. The next morning, a stranger arrived, not a friar this time, and not from a monastery. He wore traveling clothes and carried a satchel filled with scrolls. A surveyor, he claimed, sent from the county seat to inspect workshops for a new inventory. Jean had heard of this, an effort by local lords to catalog skilled laborers, perhaps for taxation or conscription. The stranger took notes, measured the furnace, counted crucibles, jotted down the number of apprentices and their ages. "What's your primary output?" he asked. "Window panes," Jean replied flatly. "Clear, decorative." Jean hesitated. "Mostly functional, some color now." The man nodded, then added something to the scroll. He left soon after, but the workshop felt different afterward. More watched, less anonymous. Jean didn't like it. That night, he told Luke something he hadn't said aloud in years. This place may not always be ours. Luke looked at him. You mean they'll shut us down? Gene shook his head. No, but they may claim it, regulate it, assign quotas, demand records. Luke didn't speak, but his jaw tightened. For centuries, Glassmakers had operated just outside the edge of formal society. They weren't quite farmers, not quite nobles, too skilled to be peasants, too dirty to be craftsmen. But they had one thing, freedom at least, the freedom to shape fire their own way. Now, that was changing. Winter crept in, and with it came the hardest part of the year, not the cold, but the damp. Moisture threatened the clay walls. Firewood was scarce. Sand arrived, frozen into clumps. The apprentices worked with red, raw hands. Gene's cough worsened. Still, the furnace never stopped. One morning, Etienne arrived late and trembling. His father, a stonemason, had fallen from scaffolding while repairing a church roof. He wouldn't survive the week. Gene gave him the day off. The next day, too. When Etienne returned, he didn't ask for sympathy. He asked to blow glass, and Gene let him. That evening, Etienne crafted a bulb of such perfect symmetry that even Luke stared. Gene said nothing, but later that night, he found the boy alone in the back, sitting beside the cooling panes. Etienne didn't look up, just asked softly, "Will anyone remember we made these?" Gene paused. "Maybe not us," he said, "but they'll remember what the light looked like." By spring, a third letter came. This time, it was from another monastery, one Gene had never heard of. They had seen the work at St. Benoit and wanted a commission of their own. Decorative borders, subtle patterns, possibly even an image of St. Apollonia in colored segments that would require skill beyond their usual capacity. Gene considered rejecting it, but Luke spoke up. "Let us try." Gene looked at him a long time, then nodded. The workshop shifted. Again, now, fine metal tools were introduced: iron scribes, miniature paddles, tweezers for adjusting shapes mid-burn. Luke practiced drawing outlines with powdered ochre before transferring the shapes to the glass. Bernard and Corentin learned to cut lead strips, cames for mounting pieces together. They studied old cathedral windows, practiced tiny swirls, learned how to twist rods to create the illusion of movement in the glass. It was clumsy at first, but slowly, as patterns emerged, color was still limited. But form was possible. Weeks passed, then months, and one day, the first decorative window was completed. Small, barely larger than a hand. It showed a red-haired figure holding a pair of pliers. Saint Apollonia, patron of dentistry, rendered in dull green and iron red. She was crooked, a little cloudy, and unforgettable. Gene didn't send it right away. He placed it on a shelf near the furnace and left it there for weeks, letting it catch the changing light, watching how her shape shifted with every hour of sun. Eventually, he packed it, but he didn't make a second one. That one he kept. Years later, Luke would take over the workshop. Gene's cough would silence him at last, and the apprentices would scatter. But one thing never changed: the fire. It never went out, because as long as someone needed a window, not for grandeur, but for shelter, someone would mix ash, sand, and try again, even if no one ever knew their names, even if the light passed right through. But isn't there something noble in being invisible, yet essential? As desk. Good evening, friends. This night, we're setting aside the stories of artisans and turning toward the materials themselves, those humble ingredients like sand and ash that held the secret to medieval color. This is the quiet science of the Middle Ages, not lightning bolts and potions, minerals, ground minerals, and the patient work of men who didn't yet know the word chemistry, but practiced it all the same. So, ease into your pillow, close your eyes if you like, and let your mind wander back to a time when the path to color began in the mud. And if this journey into medieval glass alchemy helps you feel calmer tonight, consider liking and subscribing only. If it feels right, let's begin. In the medieval world, color wasn't a matter of taste. It was a question of survival, symbolism, and sacred meaning. When people in the 13th century looked at stained glass windows, they didn't see decoration. They saw code. Blue wasn't just blue. It was the Virgin Mary's robe. Red was not just red. It was blood, martyrdom, sacrifice. Yellow might represent divine light, or sometimes treachery. But how did they make these colors? That's where our story begins, not in a palace or a cathedral, but in a pit, specifically a sand pit, because every piece of medieval stained glass started with sand. Sand was the primary ingredient, silica, but not just any sand. It needed to be clean, fine, and free of too much iron, which would darken the glass. The best sand was river sand, often from ancient stream beds, sifted by apprentices through linen cloths to remove twigs, pebbles, and anything too coarse. Some workshops even sent scouts to distant regions to collect the right kind. In Normandy, glassmakers prized the sand from the river Seine. In Venice, they used sand from the islands of Murano, carefully guarded and transported in sealed barrels. But sand alone couldn't make glass. It needed help to melt. And that's where the ash came in. The ash called flux was what lowered the melting point of silica, turning it from grainy dust into flowing, glowing liquid. Medieval glassmakers used all sorts of organic materials for ash, beechwood, oak, fern, and even seaweed in some coastal regions. Each gave a different quality to the glass. Fern ash, for example, added a green tint. Beech ash produced a more yellowish hue. The combinations were endless. It was never precise. They didn't have modern measuring tools. Instead, they relied on instinct, memory, and generations of passed down practice. Too much ash. The glass might melt quickly, but become too soft when cooled. Too little. It would remain gritty, fragile, or worse, unusable. Glassmakers mixed these materials in enormous ceramic crucibles, pots the size of small barrels, coated on the inside with clay and sand to resist the heat. These crucibles were buried in furnaces that burned day and night. Fed by charcoal or wood, temperatures reached over 1,100 degrees Celsius, and yet there were no thermometers. Instead, glassmakers judged heat by color. A dull red glow meant warming. A bright orange hue meant working. White hot. Dangerous, but sometimes necessary. Once the sand and ash were melted into a thick, honey-like liquid, it could be shaped into sheets, vessels, or beads. But to color it, they had to add something extra. Coloring agents were almost always metal-based, a fascinating quirk of medieval alchemy. Copper produced green or red, depending on the conditions. Iron gave green or brown. Manganese, often called glassmaker's soap, could turn glass purple or clear away unwanted green tints to make blue. Well, they added cobalt, a mineral mined in Saxony, traded secretly and at great cost. Blue was rare, sacred, and powerful. Even a handful of cobalt could turn a whole batch of glass a deep oceanic hue. Red, however, was the hardest to produce, not because of rarity, but because of volatility. Red glass, often called ruby glass, relied on gold. Yes, actual gold. Not in nuggets, but in microscopic particles, dissolved into the mix. It's too much, and the glass would become cloudy. Too little, and it would stay clear. Even then, conditions had to be perfect. A reducing atmosphere in the furnace, meaning very little oxygen, precise timing, and nerve. If the red didn't develop, it could ruin an entire day's work. So, why bother? Because red was holy, sacred. It was Christ's blood. It was fire and power and martyrdom all in one. Churches paid small fortunes for red glass. Some glazers never mastered it. The trickiest part was that colors didn't appear until the glass cooled. While molten, most glass looked the same, glowing orange or yellow from the heat. The hues only emerged as the temperature dropped. Mint color control was like predicting the future. Glassmakers would often take a small blob, cool it quickly, and test the result. Then, if it was wrong, they had to adjust the batch on the fly. Add more copper. Stir in a pinch of manganese. Raise the heat. Wait. Test again. It was science without science. Alchemy without spells. And it worked. Sometimes. The magic was unintentional in the forests of Germany and France. Some workshops produced glass with unplanned hues: olive green, smoke gray, honey brown. These were considered forest glass, made with high ash content from woodland, ferns, and trees. They weren't useless. In fact, they were cheaper, used for secular buildings, taverns, town halls, and farms. These pieces were thicker, cloudier, sometimes bubbled, but they let in light, kept out wind, and in certain slants of sunlight, looked quite beautiful to the modern eye. These accidents are charming to medieval glassmakers. They were just a different tier of product. Not every window needed to be divine. Some were just meant to survive. The final twist in the tale of color is this: medieval glassmakers didn't always know why their methods worked. They knew how, but not why. They didn't know that different metal oxides changed the electron behavior inside the glass. They didn't understand molecular bonding, but they observed, adjusted, perfected techniques through trial and error over centuries. They kept notebooks, sometimes encrypted. To protect trade secrets, they shared knowledge only within guilds, and they swore oaths to keep recipes secret from outsiders. In Venice, leaking a color formula could get you exiled, or worse. And yet, despite all these efforts at secrecy, the knowledge traveled slowly through trade, marriage, war, and wandering monks. Bits of alchemical wisdom spread from Germany to England, from Syria to Italy, until the patchwork of global trial and error created the medieval color palette we now admire. Today, those windows, blue, red, gold, and green, still catch the light in ancient cathedrals. They shimmer not just because of sunlight, but because of crushed bones, burned ferns, powdered metals, and centuries of forgotten hands. Isn't it strange? Something so beautiful came from such mess. The color was never guaranteed. A batch of glass, once cooled, could emerge with a flawless deep green, or a murky sludge that no one would buy. This uncertainty was the curse and gift of the medieval glazer. The only way to avoid disaster: record every variable. And so, glassmakers wrote. They kept receipt books, early manuals that detailed their mixtures, firing conditions, additives, and methods. In them, you might find lines like, to make the glass blue, place 1 measure of sand and 1 measure of beech ash, then a small measure of cobalt powder, no larger than the head of a nail. These weren't scientific documents in the modern sense, but they were meticulous. Some were encrypted, written in symbolic code or reversed Latin. To keep guild secrets, hidden guilds, especially in Italy, France, and the German principalities, controlled the flow of this knowledge tightly, and nowhere more so than in Venice. In Venice, the glassmakers of Murano were forbidden to leave the island, literally, by law. Any master glazer who left Murano with trade secrets risked imprisonment. Or worse, the Venetian Republic relied heavily on the prestige and income of its glass industry, especially colored glass, which was among the finest in Europe. The colors weren't just brighter, they were cleaner, deeper, more consistent. That was no accident. Murano glassmakers used imported ingredients, purified soda ash from Syria, fine silica from the Istrian coast, and metals shipped from as far as North Africa and Spain. They refined their crucibles, too, using a blend of fire-resistant clay and ground tile. These pots could survive longer firings and higher temperatures, allowing better control of the melt. They also worked with cristallo, nearly colorless glass developed in the 15th century, centuries ahead of its time, by removing iron, impurities, and adding manganese dioxide, which neutralized greenish tints. They achieved stunning clarity. This clarity, paradoxically, helped their colors shine brighter. Because the base glass was so pure, the added colors, cobalt, blue, ruby, red, emerald green, glowed with exceptional vibrancy. Meanwhile, in other parts of Europe, glassmakers were trying their own methods, often with wildly different results. In England, ash was made primarily from seaweed or bracken fern, resulting in darker, cloudier glass. Some English cathedrals used windows so thick and green that from outside, they looked almost like walls of Mossstadt in Germany. Forest glass ruled. This glass had high levels of potash and lime, leading to hues of smoky, olive, honey, amber, and murky. Green was imperfect, but beautiful in its own way, like fossilized sap. French glassmakers, especially in the Loire Valley, often experimented with layering, applying colored coatings onto clearer sheets of glass, then etching designs into the top layer. This allowed intricate patterns, even if the base glass wasn't ideal. Every region had its strengths and its weaknesses, but one thing united them. The desire to make color last color permanence was no small feat. Many early colorants faded over time. Gold ruby might turn brown. Manganese could wash out. Copper-based greens could grow brittle in sunlight. So glassmakers began tinkering with stabilizers, ingredients that wouldn't change the color, but would hold it in place. Some added lime, others added boron. Some experimented with animal bones, yes, actual charred bones, which added phosphate, increasing structural integrity. And through trial, error, and a bit of stubbornness, medieval glass began to last centuries. Back in the workshops, apprentices were not just learning craft, they were learning control. Each morning, they were expected to test the fire. A single coal misplaced could alter the day's temperature. Pot cracked could leak glass across the furnace floor. More than once, entire week's work was lost to a flawed crucible. Apprentices also had to learn to identify additives by smell and color. Cobalt gave off a bitter metallic scent. Copper oxide smelled faintly of sour earth. Iron oxide turned orange before darkening. Sometimes masters would test their students. A pinch of powder would be placed on the table. The student had to guess not just what it was, but how much to add and when. It was part science, part memory, and part intuition. Only after years of this ritual, and after creating consistent color, could an apprentice be allowed to record their own formulas. And that formula, it stayed in the guild in some rare cases. These records survive. One of the most famous examples is the Mappai Clavicula, a Latin technical manuscript from around the 9th to 12th century. It's a treasure trove of early recipes, not just for glass, but for pigments, inks, and metalworks. Among its entries, take copper filings and soak them in vinegar until a green mold appears. Dry it. Add to glass for the hue of river water. It sounds almost magical, but it worked. Modern scientists have analyzed medieval glass using spectroscopy and electron microscopes. What they find often confirms what medieval glazers already knew by touch and instinct. Some red glass, it discovered, contains gold particles as small as 5 nanometers. Some green glass includes calcium from burnt snail shells. Others still contain traces of volcanic sand, suggesting trade routes that spanned oceans. What this tells us is simple. The medieval glassmaker was not just an artisan. He was a geologist, chemist, an alchemist, and perhaps, most of all, a patient observer. He worked with no labs, no lenses, and no theories. And yet, through smoke and failure and endless fire, he captured the sky and windows. Isn't it strange that without trying to invent science, they practiced it better than they knew? Asterisk, the finished glass was not always beautiful. Some sheets were warped, Some came out with bubbles the size of peas. Some shattered as they cooled too quickly. Some simply had the wrong hue, a pale yellow when a warm amber was promised. But that was part of the process. No batch was perfect, no formula permanent. Every glassmaker, from the hills of Bohemia to the canals of Venice, knew that the true craft lay not in making perfection, but in knowing what to salvage from failure. The failures were not always thrown away. Sometimes they were cut into smaller pieces, slivers to patch another window. Sometimes they were melted down and tried again. And occasionally, flawed pane would be kept as a lesson. Apprentices studied these misfires like monks studied scripture. Here, too much soda ash. Here, a touch too much iron. Here, a perfect batch, but cooled unevenly on a windy day. They became a reference library of mistakes. Word count, 300, and within those mistakes, new discoveries sometimes emerged. One glassmaker in Brabant, experimenting with reused crucibles, noticed a strange red-pink hue developing where copper and gold residues overlapped. Another in Lyon, dealing with ash contaminated by herbs, created a window that glowed faint green by candlelight, quite by accident. These accidents led to new styles, to new commissions, to new arguments in the guild. For if a color had no name, no formula, and no precedent, could it be trusted? Or worse, was it repeatable? Sphere of inconsistency became central to the craft. Guilds across Europe developed reference boards, wooden panels with dozens of tiny squares of colored glass, each labeled with its composition and firing conditions. These were the medieval equivalent of a color wheel. New apprentices were drilled in their use. Match the blue from Chartres, match the green from the Saxon bishop's window, match the red from St. Denis. And they tried. Sometimes they got close. Sometimes not at all. The masters would shake their heads. Okay. Too warm, too cold, too brittle, too dull. And so the cycle continued. Word count, 600, but outside the workshops. Something else was happening. Cathedrals were rising, one by one, from England to Spain. Towers stretched toward the sky, and in those towers, more and more windows, bigger ones, more colorful ones. The demand for stained glass soared. In some cities, entire streets were dedicated to glassmakers. Horses pulled carts of sand. Barrels of ash were stored in damp basements. The smell of smoke clung to everything. Even the monks began noticing. A Benedictine chronicler in the 1200s wrote, "The sun does not shine through the glass. The glass teaches the sun how to shine." It was poetic and strangely accurate because the glass no longer served only to cover holes in stone walls. It told stories. It shaped light. It made color feel sacred. And the men who made it so often nameless became, for a moment, the authors of heaven. Word count, 900, but there were limits. As churches demanded more elaborate scenes, the need for clarity and precision grew. Suddenly, raw colored glass was not enough. Detail was required, and so began the use of paint. Glass painting involved tracing black or brown pigment, usually iron or copper oxide, mixed with vinegar and urine directly onto colored glass. Artists painted faces, folds of robes, and even architectural details. Then, the painted pieces were fired again, fusing the image into the surface. This allowed incredible precision. Eyes, fingers, halos, all now possible in glass, but not every glazier approved. Some said painting was cheating, that true color came from the furnace, not the brush. Others embraced it. Good evening once more, friends. Tonight, we slip behind the guarded walls of a quiet island in the Venetian lagoon, a place where the glassmakers were not just artisans, but state secrets. Okay? This is a story of isolation, invention, quiet rivalry, and fire that never stopped glowing. even when no one outside was allowed to see it. So take a deep breath. Let the weight of your blanket hold you steady, okay? And drift with me into the flickering world of Murano, where every glow from a furnace might contain both beauty and betrayal. And as always, if this calm story helps you rest, you're welcome to like or subscribe, but only if it feels right. Let's begin. It was not the glittering palaces of Venice that first made its glass famous. It was its fear in the 13th century. The Venetian Republic was growing wealthy. Its merchant fleet stretched across the Adriatic, and its political reach touched ports from Constantinople to Alexandria, traded spices, silk, dyes, and glass. But the glassmakers of Venice posed a problem. Their furnaces were dangerous. Open flame in a wooden city. Their workshops were hot, crowded, unpredictable. More than once, fires had spread from a glass studio to entire neighborhoods. The solution? Move them in 1291. The Venetian government issued a decree. All glass production must relocate to the island of Murano, just north of the main city, separated by a narrow channel of water. And so began one of the strangest social experiments in medieval Europe. An entire island. Class. Life on Murano was unlike anywhere else in Venice. The island became a world of its own. Rows of low workshops, wide chimneys belching white smoke, carts carrying barrels of ash, and blocks of quartz across narrow alleys. Every building hummed with heat. At the heart of it all were the confraternities, the guilds. These weren't loose associations. They were tightly controlled institutions, with rules written in fine ink and enforced with fines, exile, and, in rare cases, violence. Joining a glass guild required lineage, apprenticeship, and reputation. A master glassmaker could take decades to rise, and once accepted, swore lifelong loyalty in return. He received protection and limits. He could not leave Murano without permission. He could not share techniques with outsiders. He could not open a workshop outside the island. He was free, but fenced in. The reasoning was simple. Venice guarded its secrets like a dragon guards gold. Glass was money, and colored glass, clear, precise, stunningly vibrant glass, was more than craft. It was diplomacy, a royal wedding gift, a bishop's treasure. Letting those recipes fall into foreign hands would weaken the Republic's grip. So Murano became both sanctuary and cage. The guilds operated with surprising structure. Each had ranks: apprentice, assistant, journeyman, and master. Each had dues, ritual oaths, secret recipes, hand tools passed down through families. But beyond the furnaces, something else burned. Rivalry. Workshops competed for commissions from dukes and cardinals. They spied on one another, sometimes bribing apprentices to steal a glance at a new cooling formula or to eavesdrop on a master's firing schedule. There were no factory walls. Every building had vents, chimneys, doorways half open to the canal breeze. Secrets leaked like steam, and yet no one dared go too far. The Council of Ten, Venice's feared ruling body, kept close tabs on Murano. Any glassmaker caught smuggling techniques to other cities, especially to competitors in France or the German states, faced swift punishment. Some were jailed, some were blacklisted. A few simply disappeared. That fear kept the guilds quiet, but it also made them clever. If they couldn't leave, they would bring the world to them. Wealthy patrons from across Europe came to Murano by boat. They stayed in guest houses, sipped wine while viewing glass samples, and ordered chandeliers, goblets, window panes, beads, all in colors never seen before. Red like flame, green like emeralds, blue as deep as the Adriatic. The secret, oxides. Yes, but also purity. Murano's furnaces used white sand imported from Istria, mixed with soda ash refined in clay pots for days. Their crucibles were made of special kaolin clays that could withstand intense heat. Their firing schedules were calculated to the hour, even if they had no clocks. Some workshops specialized in millefiori patterned glass, resembling tiny flowers. Others crafted aventurine, glittering glass made by suspending copper crystals. Inside the melt, these were not just techniques. They were magic tricks with recipes known only to a few each night. The masters locked their notebooks in iron chests. Apprentices signed their names to parchment contracts. And still, whispers spread. One story from the 14th century tells of a man named Pietro di Zorzi, a master glazier who invented a method for creating perfectly clear glass, free of bubbles, with just a faint lavender tint. Pietro became famous across Murano. His glass was ordered by the Doge himself, but within a year, Pietro vanished. No body was found. No boat was reported missing. Some said he had sold his recipe to the Genoese and fled under cover of night. Others said the council had taken him quietly. Cleanly, his workshop was boarded up. His tools vanished. The recipe, if it ever existed, was lost. And yet, centuries later, pieces of lavender glass were still found in old palazzos. Pietro's ghost, some say, never left Murano. For all their secrecy, Murano's glassmakers left behind little evidence of their inner lives. Their windows rarely bore signatures. Their goblets were often anonymous, and yet their legacy endures, not in names, but in shimmer, a quell, in the warmth of light passing through centuries-old color. Maybe it's fitting that those who guarded their secrets most fiercely are remembered most softly. Morning on Murano did not begin with birdsong. It began with cold shovels, the rattle of tongs, the hiss of steam escaping from crucibles as the day's first batch of glass began to melt. The island stirred early, but slowly. Unlike the fishmongers and merchants of Venice proper, the glassmakers knew they had all day and all night. Time on Murano didn't follow bells or markets. It followed heat, and once the furnaces were hot, everything else, contracts, politics, meals came second. Most workshops were family businesses. The master glazier lived upstairs or next door. His sons were his apprentices. His wife and daughters might help polish finished goods, wrap orders in cloth, or prepare records. The workshops smelled of mineral dust, warm ash, and seawater. Their walls were lined with shelves holding jars of strange materials: copper scale, lead powder, sulfur, powdered animal bones, iron shavings, each labeled with a mark or symbol, not always words. Recipes were guarded, even inside. Families. A father might teach one son the method for red dot, another the method for gold flecked beads. This way, no single person knew everything. It wasn't mistrust. It was insurance. If a recipe was lost to illness, to exile, another family member could still keep the business alive. Some secrets, they said, were too valuable for a single lifetime. And so, generation after generation, the work continued. Crucibles were prepared from a blend of crushed tile, clay, and river mud, molded by hand, fired dry, then baked slowly for days before being exposed to molten glass. The glass itself was mixed, melted for hours, sometimes days. It was washed, mid-firing, with salt or urine to remove impurities. Apprentices took shifts stirring the viscous mass with thick rods. Wrapped in cloth, burns were common. So were singed eyebrows. But few complained, because by the time you reached journeyman rank, your sense of pain had changed. What others called scalding, you called warm. What others called dangerous, you called familiar. Outside the workshop, Murano remained eerily quiet. There were no gondoliers calling out prices, no market criers shouting to catch of the day. There was only the crackle of fire and the occasional sound of molten glass being rolled across a stone slab. The hum of centuries in a single note. The politics of Murano were just as delicate as the glass it produced. Workshops competed fiercely for noble contracts. Glassmakers paid for placement in church windows, for the right to produce chandeliers for a senator's banquet hall, for exclusivity with a certain trade family. And yet, outwardly, they showed unity. During festivals, they marched together in matching robes with banners of the guild held high. Their symbols, often a lion or a furnace or a crown of flame, fluttered in the sea breeze, as if to remind Venice that this little island was part of the Republic, but also a part. When plague struck the city, Murano often escaped the worst. Its isolation helped, but more than that, few people came and went without reason. That included illness. Still, every few decades, a fire would break out. A furnace wall would crack. A shipment of imported sand would arrive contaminated, and then the rivalries sharpened. Glassmakers whispered of sabotage, poisoned crucibles, misdirected barges. One infamous workshop, Sampierre's, was said to have collapsed not from accident, but from a bribe to a dock worker who accidentally dropped a barrel of salt into their melt. Inside the guilds, punishments were strict. An apprentice who spoke out of turn, or worse, tried to leave the island, could be publicly flogged. A master who attempted to duplicate another's formula would be fined half a year's earnings. Repeat. Offenders were expelled from the guild, a fate worse than poverty. Without guild protection, no one would sell to you. No one would hire you. You couldn't buy crucibles. You couldn't rent workshop space. You became invisible. And for a glassmaker, being unseen was death. Yet somehow, in this cloistered, fire-lit world, innovation still bloomed. They invented the mirror, a flat, silver-backed pane of glass that shocked Europe. They created Latimo, a milky white glass that mimicked porcelain. They mastered enamel painting, adding intricate scenes to vases and goblets that looked like miniatures on paper. Some began combining colors in the same object. Ruby stems on sapphire bowls, gold flecked scrollwork on green vessels, kaleidoscope trapped in sand and flame dot. And every time a new style was created, it came not with celebration, but with secrecy, because the rule remained. What was discovered on Murano stayed on Murano. Word count 1,200, but even guild walls could not hold back time. By the late 15th century, secrets began to leak. A few glassmakers fled, lured by bribes from French kings or English barons. Some were captured and returned. Others disappeared forever, starting new workshops in Prague, in London. One even turned up in Constantinople, crafting blue windows for a mosque. Venice tried to tighten its grip. It offered pensions too. Loyal masters, married daughters of glassmakers, 2 senators' sons, built tighter registries of formulas, but it was like trying to hold melted glass in your bare hands. Eventually, it slips away. Today, the guilds of Murano still exist in name. The island still makes glass, still glows with heat, smells of ash and copper and brine. But the secrets, many are lost, and those that remain aren't written down. They're in the hands of old men who stir melted silica, not by recipe, but by rhythm. They don't explain. They just say, "You'll know when it's ready." Maybe the greatest secret wasn't the formula, but the patience to wait for it to show itself. The master glassmaker sat alone in the furnace room. The fire had been burning since before dawn, fed in careful increments. Outside, the narrow canals of Murano were silent, just a few gulls and the occasional sound of a barge shifting in its moorings. But inside, the room pulsed with heat. Orange glow danced across the walls. The shelves cast long shadows. The crucibles, round and heavy, radiated softly. In front of him was a new batch. He didn't need to test it, not really. He could smell the temperature in the ash. He could see the thickness of the melt from a single glance at the glowing lip of the pot. This was the 5th batch that week. All for one commission. A cathedral in Avignon had requested a full cycle of Saint windows, each with blue backgrounds. Deep, flawless blue. That meant cobalt. That meant extreme precision. That meant everything had to go exactly right. The problem was, he was running out of cobalt. Cobalt was expensive. It had to be mined in Saxony, ground down, purified. It traveled across half of Europe in small packets wrapped in goat leather, each barely the size of a hand. One mistake, one batch ruined by a wrong crucible or a shift in wind, and you could lose it all. There was no second chance with blue. The master took a breath, then dipped a long iron rod into the molten mix. He twisted once, slowly, and lifted. The blob of molten glass stretched and held. No collapsing, no cracking dot. So far, so good. But the real test would be after cooling. He placed the molten piece onto the marver, a flat stone surface, and began shaping. The glow started to dim. The rich orange dulled to brown, then to gray. It would be hours before the color revealed itself. This was always the waiting part, and waiting made masters anxious. Meanwhile, the apprentices worked in the side room, loading finished sheets into padded crates. Each sheet was inspected, stamped with the guild symbol, a lion paw within a ring of flame, and sealed with a strip of wax-soaked linen. One apprentice, Matteo, moved slowly today. He was distracted. He had received a letter that morning. His cousin, also a glassworker, had died in Prague. Some said it was plague. Others said he had been killed for passing secrets to a Bohemian noble family. No one knew for sure, but even in Murano, they had heard stories. Apprentices disappearing. Recipes turning up in foreign cities. Guild secrets that had somehow slipped out of locked chests. The older masters said the walls of the island weren't as solid as they used to be. But Matteo didn't care about that. He only cared that his cousin had gone north, had tried something daring, and now he was gone. And Matteo was still here, still in the heat, still under watch, still reciting the same oaths every month, like the walls could talk. He pressed his fingers gently against a cooled blue pane and asked under his breath, "Is it worth it?" In the next room, the master heard nothing. He was focused now, walking the perimeter of the furnace, checking the support bricks for stress cracks. Every 6 months, the entire furnace had to be rebuilt. The intense heat caused expansion, contraction, and eventual decay. It was normal, but the timing had to be perfect. If it collapsed mid-commission, they would lose everything: clients, orders, credibility. The guild could shield them from ruin, but not forever. He picked up a short mallet and tapped the bricks, listening for change in tone. A hollow echo meant fracture. A sharp ring meant solid clay. Most rang clean. One sounded wrong. He paused. He tapped again. Still wrong. A spiderweb crack had formed beneath the surface, small but growing. He could patch it for now. Mix clay, ash, and salt, then apply it while the wall cooled. But that would mean halting the melt, and that would delay the delivery. He sat down, suddenly aware of his age. He had been here since he was 13, learned to shape by watching his uncle, took over the workshop when his cousin left for Florence, built his own crucibles, mixed his own ash, made his own enemies, and now here he was, deciding whether a crack in the wall would destroy everything. He stood up slowly and got to work. The patch took hours. When it was done, he opened the viewing slot and checked the batch. It had cooled, and the blue. It was there. Not sky blue, not navy, but that strange, holy blue, deep and eternal, like church shadows. He smiled for just a second, then called Matteo to lift it. Later that night, as the fire dimmed, Matteo remained in the workshop. After the others had gone, he touched the blue pane again. It was warm. He turned it slightly, watching the candlelight ripple inside. Then he reached into his satchel and pulled out a piece of paper, folded, smudged, a copied recipe. He looked at it for a long time. The measurements were careful, oxides exact, the ratios flawless. He had memorized it already. The original had been destroyed. He could take it with him, head north, sell it, use it. He folded it again, then threw it into the furnace. It flared once, briefly, then turned to ash the next morning. He showed up early, took his place at the marver, didn't say a word. The master, watching from the corner, nodded. Once, he understood and said nothing, because sometimes loyalty wasn't about silence. It was about choosing the fire when you didn't have to. And maybe that's the secret Murano guarded all along. Not formulas, but the people willing to burn for them. The cathedral is silent, not empty. No, far from it. There are priests, candle bearers, a few scattered pilgrims, the usual creaks of old stone, a flutter of pigeons in the upper eaves. But it is still that peculiar hush that lives only in sacred places. Now look upward. The wall facing east is made not of stone or wood, but glass. Dozens of tall, arched panels, red, gold, blue, green, glitter softly in the morning sun. They stretch as high as rooftops, towering above the altar. This is no decoration. This is a sermon in color. In the 12th and 13th centuries, cathedrals were not just places of worship. They were books, storybooks, history books, prayer books. For a mostly illiterate population, they were the only place to read the past. And the windows, they were chapters. Stained glass in medieval churches wasn't arranged randomly. Every panel, every figure, every tint had meaning. These weren't just pretty windows. They were visual theology. The sequence usually began at the bottom, where the earthly world lived. Farmers, stonemasons, merchants, women at wells, children playing beggars, shepherds taught above them came the prophets, the apostles, and saints, the heavenly world, and at the top, often in the very center, Christ seated in majesty, or the Virgin Mary surrounded by angels. Or the Last Judgment, a reminder to everyone below of what waited above. It was designed like a cosmic ladder. The closer to the heavens you looked, the closer to salvation you came in Chartres Cathedral, one of the most famous surviving stained glass programs in the world. You'll find over 150 windows, each telling a different story. There's the story of Noah, with tiny animals entering an ark to be two. There's St. Nicholas, saving sailors from a storm. There's Jesus turning water into wine. But also, there's the story of local guilds, the butchers, the shoemakers, the bakers, all paid to have their trades immortalized in glass. In return, they received a panel in the lower windows, showing their tools, their aprons, their work, and above them, saints looked on. It was a kind of medieval sponsorship and a spiritual tax write-off for the viewer. Stained glass was overwhelming. Imagine walking into a vast stone hall, cold and echoing, and suddenly being bathed in red and gold light. The sun moves, the colors shift. The saints seem to flicker. For a peasant seeing this for the first time, it wasn't art, it was a miracle. People wept, children stared, pilgrims prayed, not just to statues, but to the colors themselves, believing the light that passed through the saints. Images might carry their blessings, and perhaps they were right, because the design wasn't just visual, it was emotional. The reds were deep and bloody. The blues were oceanic and calm. The greens were earthy, grounding. The yellows rare, warm, and glowing were often reserved for halos or divine radiance. This color coding allowed even those who couldn't read Latin to understand what they saw. You didn't need a degree to know that red meant sacrifice, or that a circle of gold around someone's head meant you should listen. Or kneel. The stories, too, were often arranged in panels that read like comic strips. The Annunciation, the Visitation, the Nativity, each image framed within its border, with expressions exaggerated so even someone standing 30 feet below could see who was surprised, who was afraid, who was holy. It was visual literacy, long before schools taught reading. In some cathedrals, windows were arranged by theme. One chapel might focus on the Passion, Christ's betrayal, arrest, crucifixion, and resurrection. Another might feature miracles. Another, Old Testament stories, Abraham, Isaac, Moses, and some focused on local saints, with panels showing familiar towns, clothing, even the cathedral itself. It was a feedback loop. The more the townspeople gave to the church, the more they saw themselves reflected in the sacred space. Some families paid for whole panels to depict themselves as donors, kneeling at the feet of saints. Others were immortalized simply as symbols. A wheel for the Cooper's Guild, a knife for the butchers, a boot for the cobblers. Even the rose windows, those great circular bursts of glass high above the nave, followed logic. They represented the divine order. 12 petals for 12 apostles, 4 outer circles for the Gospels, the center. Almost always Christ, the Lamb of God, or a blazing golden cross. It wasn't random. It was math, sacred geometry, stained in glass. But perhaps the most powerful part of these windows was not what they showed, but when they were seen, they changed with the sun. A panel might be invisible at dawn, but blaze into life at noon. By evening, it might fade to shadow again. Some windows were meant only to be seen in the afternoon, when the light hit them sideways. Others, facing east, caught the first rays of sunrise during morning mass. This shifting light gave the stories movement, made them feel alive, made the stone cathedral feel like it breathed. And then came silence. Over time, many of these windows were destroyed in wars and fires during iconoclastic revolutions. Some were smashed for being too Catholic. Others were melted down to recover lead or gold. The stories darkened. The saints disappeared, but the few that remain, God, they still speak, not with sound, not with words, but with the language of light, patient, flickering, eternal. Today, when you step into an old cathedral and feel that warm band of color fall across your hands, you are reading a page of a medieval storybook, one made not of ink, but flame and mineral and glass. And that story, once meant for peasants and pilgrims, now whispers to you, too. Maybe stained glass was never made to last forever. It's only long enough for the next person to understand the message. Stained glass was never just about holiness. It was also about power, because in the Middle Ages, few things sent a clearer message than placing your name or your likeness in a church window, right alongside the saints. It meant you belonged there. It meant your story mattered, and it meant everyone who walked into the cathedral would see you in the light of heaven. Donors, patrons, noble families, merchant guilds, they all knew the value of being seen in glass. Some gave generously, for spiritual reasons. Others gave because they knew history, once fixed in color, would stay fixed in memory. And so the stories began to shift, not with lies, but with emphasis. Take the Cathedral of Bourges in France. Alongside the usual saints and apostles, you'll find windows that show tailors stitching robes, wine merchants unloading barrels, and lawyers signing contracts. Why? Because they paid for it. Each guild funded a different window, and in return, their daily lives were woven into the divine narrative. Above the cobbler's tools, scenes from the life of Saint Crispin, the patron saint of shoemakers. Above the fishmongers, Christ walking on water. Above the bakers, a miracle of loaves and fishes. The sacred and the secular merged. It was subtle, storytelling, grounding heaven in the everyday. In England, it became even more political during the Wars of the Roses. Certain noble families commissioned windows with colors that matched their houses: red for Lancaster, white for York, Some inserted their family crests beneath the feet of saints. A few even slipped themselves into the crowd scenes of biblical stories. One window at York Minster, for example, shows the Last Supper, but look closely. One of the apostles wears the face of a local patron, complete with his 15th century English beard and robes. He gazes reverently at Christ, hands folded, eyes lifted. It was both humble, small, and proud. But what happens when the message changes? When new kings take the throne? When the Reformation sweeps through? The glass had to adapt or disappear. Across Europe, particularly in Protestant regions, stained glass was smashed, melted, or painted over. Saints were declared idolatrous. Stories deemed superstitious. Rich color gave way to clear panes, letting in light, but not meaning. Some churches removed windows and stored them in barns. Others sold them to private collectors. A few brave glaziers painted over sacred scenes with gray paste, temporarily erasing the saints in hopes they might be restored later. In some places, worked. In others, the stories were lost forever. But even as churches changed, new kinds of stories emerged. In the 17th and 18th centuries, glass was used to depict allegories, justice, mercy, charity, or even scenes from classical mythology. Pagan gods found their way into chapels, and in the 19th century, stained glass made a comeback, this time as a form of historical nostalgia. Gothic revival swept across Europe. Old cathedrals were restored, new ones built to look medieval. Windows once again told biblical tales, but now with Victorian faces, romantic poses, and impossibly rich colors, thanks to industrial dyes. A window from 1250 showed raw emotion. A window from 1850 idealized beauty. The language of glass had changed dialects. Yet even now, even in modern churches, stained glass continues to speak. New windows tell the story of war memorials, civil rights heroes, lost children, and pandemisics in one chapel. In Germany, a window depicts DNA strands in another, the Twin Towers in yet another. The life of a local doctor who treated cholera patients during the 19th century outbreak. The medium stayed the same, but the message grew. The saints now include nurses. The miracles include clean water. The halos belong to those who serve, not just those who preach. It may seem strange to think of stained glass telling contemporary stories, but that was always its role. To freeze light at the moment of history, to capture a feeling, grief, awe, survival in something that does not decay. Stone crumbles, paint fades, but glass remembers. And the best part, even if the story disappears, someone, somewhere will still see beauty. A child, bored during a service, will look up, and for no reason at all, their eyes will stop on a panel showing a man feeding birds, or a woman giving water to a traveler, or a star in a blue sky made of tiny triangles of cut cobalt. They won't know the name, they won't understand the theology, but they'll remember the color, they'll remember the feeling, and in that moment, quiet, brief, meaningless to anyone else, the window speaks again. This is the quiet truth of stained glass. It's not made to be read like a book, it's made to be felt. A glance, a shimmer, a whisper in light. When the world burns or changes or forgets, glass continues shining, not because it resists time, but because it lets time pass through it. And each time the sun returns, so does the story. Maybe that's why stained glass endures, not for what it shows, but for how it keeps showing it. Every piece of stained glass was handmade, cut by hand, colored by hand, painted by hand, fired, framed, installed, all by hands that would never sign the work. This anonymity was not shameful. It was expected because the work belonged to the church, to God, to the people, not the artist. And yet, hidden in the corners of some windows, barely visible, you'll sometimes find small marks, a curled initial, a tiny face, a dog tucked beneath a saint's sandal, a woman's profile in a tree. These were the artist's whispers, not signatures, but fingerprints, proof that someone had been there. It wasn't always a single artist. Most windows were a group effort, designed by one, shaped by another, painted by a third. Some worked on nothing but borders. Others only did the faces. One master, famous in northern France, refused to paint noses, said he always made them too sad. Instead, his apprentice did them all. This layering of work meant the final window was not just a story of saints, but a story of the workshop itself. You could trace a generation by style, shift in how folds were drawn, the evolution of how halos were shaped, thick bands in the 12th century, thin lines by the 14th. Some artists were meticulous with hands, rendering them bones and veins. Others cared only for eyes. Over time, windows became timelines, not just of heaven, but of human hands. And then there was glass itself, the medium with memory. Unlike stone, didn't age gracefully. It shifted. Over centuries, some colored panes darkened, others faded, some cracked under temperature swings. Others sagged slightly under their own weight, but most survived, not in perfect form, but alive. They warped, they blistered, but they still caught light. In some cathedrals, you'll see patches, pieces that don't quite match, a pale yellow next to a rich gold, a blue slightly deeper than its neighbors. These aren't mistakes, they're restorations. In times of war or poverty, when original glass shattered, glazers replaced it with whatever they had, sometimes from other churches, sometimes from broken panels stored in dusty cellars. This created unintentional collages. 19th century angel next to a 13th century apostle, that a modern flower blooming beside a medieval sheep. And yet, somehow, the window still tells a story, not one of neatness, but one of survival. One panel at Reims Cathedral, for example, has a modern square of plain glass with nothing on it, no color, no image. It fills a hole made by a shell in World War I. That square has stayed, it's unpainted, for over a century. It says nothing, and yet it says everything. A moment of silence made visible. In recent years, stained glass has found new voices. Some churches commission windows for lost children, some for climate change, some for Holocaust remembrance, and in one London chapel, a stained glass panel includes nothing but names, the names of immigrants who died crossing the English Channel. No saints, no halos, just names. The colors are muted blues, browns, whites. The faces are absent, but the story is unmistakable. These aren't windows to look through, they're windows to feel through. Because when you stand in front of them, the light falls on you. You don't just see the story, you become part of it. And this, maybe more than anything, is why stained glass has lasted so long. It's not a mirror, it's not a screen. It doesn't ask you to look at yourself. It asks you to look through, to see the people who came before, to remember the ones who are gone, to imagine those yet to come. Each shard of color, each imperfect ripple is a small reminder that someone once believed this world was worth illuminating, even if their name was never known, even if their voice was never heard, even if the sun someday stops shining through. There is a window in Canterbury. It shows a woman kneeling above her, an angel with open arms. The woman's hands are raised, not in worship, but in offering. She holds no crown, no relic, no coin, only light, clear, pale, untouched. It passes through her fingers and falls onto the stone floor. Most visitors never notice this panel. It's tucked behind a pillar, high up, but if you stand at the right angle, just before sunset, the beam lands directly on a cracked stair, a spot thousands have stepped on. worn smooth. For just a few minutes each day, that old stair glows, not with color, not with symbol, okay, but with light that remembers. Maybe that's what stained glass was. Always meant to do, not preserve the past, but remind us that it's still shining. A traveler arrives in town with dust on his boots and coins in his satchel. He's been walking for weeks, from a fishing village in Brittany, over rivers, through forests, across worn stone bridges. His destination is a cathedral, not for mass, not for confession, but for proof. Proof that he came, proof that he was seen. And in the cathedral, the proof is waiting, not just in relics, but in glass. A small panel, high on a wall, shows a group of pilgrims on foot. They carry staffs. They wear hats with scallop shells. One holds a little bag, shaped just like his own. He points to it. "That's him," he says. "That's me." This was one of the strange truths of medieval Christianity. Faith didn't just travel to churches, it funded them. Pilgrimage was one of the major engines of religious infrastructure in the Middle Ages. People didn't just visit shrines. They spent money along the way at inns, in markets, in chapels. And when they arrived at their destination, they often gave a little more. Some donated in silver. Others brought goods, wool, food, even small livestock, and a few paid for windows. In cathedrals like Chartres, York, Canterbury, or Compostela, pilgrims' donations were gathered and pooled. These funds went not just to the upkeep of relics, but to the building itself, the vaults, the buttresses, and yes, the stained glass. Sometimes a bishop would issue a call for donations, promising indulgences or blessings in return. These campaigns might last years. They would be mentioned at sermons, carved onto stones, sung in processions, and when the money came in, it was used strategically. A new chapel for St. James, a new rose window facing Jerusalem, a series of windows showing the miracles of Mary. Pilgrims helped write those stories, not with words, but with coins. And the church told them back. In light, some pilgrim-funded windows were humble. They showed road scenes, travelers sleeping, sharing bread, praying beneath trees. Others were triumphant, saints guiding ships, healing wounds, shielding pilgrims from wolves. Often, these stories mirrored real dangers. Pilgrimage wasn't easy. It involved hunger, theft, injury, sickness, and doubt. Glass panels showing these hardships reminded pilgrims that their suffering had meaning. They weren't alone. Even saints had walked. Even saints had bled. Even saints had feared. And so the windows offered comfort, not from above, but from beside. You didn't have to be noble to appear in glass. You just had to walk. But not all patrons were poor. In fact, some of the most lavish windows came from royal and papal sponsorship. Popes in Rome commissioned glass for churches they'd never visit. Kings in England sent glazers to France to study colors. Queens donated dowries to complete unfinished chapels. For the powerful, stained glass was legacy. Stone bore names, but glass carried memory. One royal donor in Spain had his name worked into the border of every panel in Latin. Yes, but also in Castilian, the common tongue. He wanted everyone, not just scholars, to know who paid for the light. Another in France had a window made with imported blue from Syria, because the local hues weren't deep enough. It wasn't just devotion, it was branding. At times, donors argued with clergy over what should be shown. A bishop might request the Passion of Christ. A nobleman might prefer scenes from the Book of Kings to reflect his lineage. A local guild might want to include a saint wearing their tools. A way to say, "We were here." In some cases, these disagreements played out in the windows themselves. One panel might show a saint healing the sick, a bishop's request. The next might show him blessing a vineyard, the donor's suggestion, side by side, sacred and strategic. Over time, some pilgrims began returning to the same shrines not for prayer, but to see their image in the windows, their likeness, their gift. It became a kind of holy tourism, a pilgrimage of recognition. See that figure? One man told his grandson, "That's our coat of arms." See that scene? A widow whispered, "That's the saint who saved your father." Even without faces, even without names. The glass held memory, and that memory passed through generations like a story told through sunlight. But the glass was fragile. Wars broke out, towns were burned, windows shattered in some churches. The fragments were gathered like bones, mended with lead, rearranged into new patterns. You can still see them, mosaics of mismatched scenes, a saint beside a vine, a pilgrim under a lamb. Nothing quite fits, and yet everything shines, because the point was never perfect storytelling. The point was to remember why the glass was made, not just to show heaven, but to show that people cared enough to try. Okay. Final story at the Cathedral of La Puy in southern France. There is a small panel, half obscured, in the corner of a larger window. It shows a man kneeling before an altar. He is not a saint, not a king, just a traveler. His hat is crumpled, his bag is patched, okay? His sandals are broken, and behind him, Archangel Michael resting a hand gently on his shoulder. There is no name, no explanation, just the light falling through his figure, year after year, century after century. Some say he was a real man, some say he never existed, but for those who enter the cathedral, weary and uncertain, that image is enough, because it says, you arrived to were seen, and the light remembered. And maybe that's the heart of stained glass, not just sacred images for the holy, but a flicker of kindness for everyone who dared to look up. Every donation, no matter how small, made the story bigger. Every window, no matter how high, cast a shadow on the floor, and every footstep through a cathedral added another layer of memory to the color. Stained glass didn't just reflect heaven, it was built by those still walking toward it. Pilgrimage had a rhythm, the flow of people in spring and summer, the trickle in winter. Feast days that filled cities with travelers, festivals that swelled ends to breaking. Each year brought waves of footsteps and satchels, prayers and coins, and cathedrals, especially those guarding relics, learned to prepare. They hired more jellahs, they built new chapels in advance of crowds, and they used stained glass to ease the miracles inside. A saint raising the dead, a woman healed of blindness, a cripple throwing away crutches, all told in blue and red and gold, not for those inside, but for those arriving. The message was clear. This is a place where light touches the sick. Relics were the draw. Bones, cloth, blood, any physical link to the saints. Churches that housed them became pilgrimage destinations, and stained glass became both storytelling and signage. Some windows even depicted the relic itself, a glowing box held by angels, or a reliquary atop an altar. One famous example shows Saint Foy's golden statue seated like a queen, receiving offerings from pilgrims. Around her, smaller scenes show the miracles she performed, healing fevers, calming storms, unbinding prisoners, and below, the donors kneel, often faceless, sometimes labeled devotus, ignotus, an unknown worshiper. This anonymity didn't lessen their gift. If anything, it elevated it. It became every man's prayer. But not all pilgrimages were personal. Some were political. In times of plague, drought, or war, entire cities would send delegations to holy sites, not for spiritual growth, but for divine intervention. Protect us in this sickness. Let the harvest return. And often they would leave behind a gift, money, gold, glass, in hopes that their gesture would be enough. Churches recorded these events in windows. Look closely in some cathedrals and you'll see strange panels. A group of helmeted knights kneeling before a saint. A burning village behind a figure holding a cross. A king offering a sword, not to Christ, but to a bishop. These weren't random stories. They were transactions, public prayers, broadcast in glass. The role of the glazer in all this was unusual. He was not a priest, not a pilgrim, not a nobleman, but he stood in the middle of their stories. He received instructions, showed the miracle, made the saint look radiant, include the town banner, and turned them into colored scenes. Some workshops even created templates for common miracles. A blind man kneeling, eyes open, a ship tossed in waves, then safely harbored. A mother holding her healed child. These designs could be reused across regions, like early icons, adjusted slightly, but always recognizable. But each one needed to feel personal. No one gave their life savings for generic grace. The window had to say, "This is my prayer." Glazers began adding regional details in a Spanish window. A saint might wear a red sash instead of white in a German window. The landscape would include pine forests instead of olive groves. In one English chapel, St. Thomas, Becket appears walking past a field of sheep, not because of doctrine, but because the chapel was built by a wool guild. Glass became localization, spiritual storytelling, with hometown flair. Even more fascinating were the miracle report. Windows. Some churches had entire walls dedicated to documented healings, scenes submitted by pilgrims, recorded by monks, and approved by bishops. A woman touched the altar and her fever broke. A merchant gave alms and survived a storm at sea. A boy prayed at the relic of a martyr and began to speak after being mute since birth. These windows were testimonials, medieval, Yelp reviews in colored glass. Some even included before and after panels, one side showing the illness, the next the recovery. Others featured texts, short Latin phrases, Sanctus intervenit, the saint intervened, or Gratias Deo, Acte sent, thanks be given to God. These panels were as important as any sermon. They showed that prayer worked, that miracles happened, that giving to the church had results, and that light was the medium for truth. But behind every miracle window was a ledger. The church recorded each donation, each name, each reason, each coin, not out of greed, though wealth certainly played a part, but out of a belief that faith should be remembered. One scribe in Reims wrote, "As stone remembers name, let glass remember mercy." And sometimes mercy was complicated. One nobleman in the 14th century funded a stunning rose window, blues imported from Syria, reds made with real gold, faces painted by Italy's best. He said it was in thanks for the safe birth of his son. But everyone in town knew it was penance. He had led a raid on a rival city 2 years earlier. Dozens had died. The window, it was said, cost more than the homes of 50 villagers. And yet, there it was, shining, beautiful, redemption, in glass. That was the power of stained glass. As a donation, it could reframe the past. A soldier became a protector. A thief became a giver. A mistake became a lesson, illuminated by sunlight in some cathedrals. The donor records are still intact. Scrolls of names, amounts given, notes like, for the healing of a sister, for the forgiveness of a storm, for a son lost to fever, for a father who did not return from the crusade. These gifts may seem small, a coin, a half loaf of bread, a ribbon of colored glass, but they built CHAPELS saints in color, told stories that no one else was telling. And when you stand beneath those windows today, you may not know the donors' names, but the light that touches your face, that's theirs, still giving, still speaking, still remembering. Maybe that's what makes stained glass. More than art, it is donation that never stops donating. Stained glass, for all its beauty, was never cheap. Even the humblest pane required dozens of steps, preparing the sand, refining the ash, firing the crucibles, coloring the melt, cutting the pieces, soldering the lead, cames, painting the details, and installing the final product, high into cold. Wind-blown stone walls. It took labor, it took skill, and most of all, it took money. But unlike statues or frescoes, stained glass carried something else, something more. Fluid. It carried the weight of intention, because no one donated for glass without a reason. Sometimes it was legacy. A wealthy widow giving her last coins for a panel of St. Catherine, her name inscribed in Latin below the saint's sandaled feet. Sometimes it was guilt. A merchant who cheated scales one too many times, paying for an image of Christ forgiving the tax collector. Sometimes it was fear. A town recovering from plague, funding a window of St. Sebastian. Arrows removed from his side, standing tall again. And sometimes it was gratitude. A sailor returning from a storm. A woman surviving childbirth. A boy learning to walk. All of them left something behind. A gift not of gold or silver, but of light. And the glaziers, in turn, turned those gifts into stories. Cathedrals. Over time came mosaics of these prayers, not just in the windows, but in the very way windows were arranged. One apse might show healing. One transept might focus on protection. A side chapel might feature saints who watched over children. And at the very entrance, a great rose window made from the donations of travelers. Pilgrims, after all, were not just visitors. They were shareholders. Every coin dropped into the cathedral chest helped shape what future pilgrims would see. The fascinating part. This wasn't centrally planned. There was no blueprint from Rome dictating the color of a saint's robe or the pose of an angel. The choices were made locally, negotiated between church leaders, patrons, artists, and sometimes entire guilds. The result. Each cathedral became utterly unique. Yes, they shared common saints, familiar stories, standard symbols, but the style, the details, the tone, those were shaped by the people in ruling. The saints look weary, worn, a city battered by centuries of conflict. In Burgos, they smile, radiant, a center of joy, of gold, of pilgrimage. In Prague, their eyes are sharp, alert, a town of scholars and suspicion. Glass became a mirror of place, of mood, of memory, and this wasn't lost on the viewers. Even peasants who couldn't read Latin knew which saints were theirs. They'd point them out to their children. This is the saint who healed your sister. This one protected our wheat. This one watches your grandfather's grave. The glass was never abstract. It was personal, and though the names of the donors faded, the emotions they gave stayed in the light. Sometimes, even the failures were remembered. One chapel in northern France tried to commission a panel of St. Martin, dividing his cloak for a beggar. But funds ran out halfway through. Only the outline was completed. It remains that way, even now, half finished. And yet, people stop and stare. They see the sketch of generosity, the ghost of intention, and perhaps that's more powerful than perfection, because it reminds us, sometimes, the effort was the prayer. In other places, panels were stolen. During war, invasion, revolution, glass was pried from windows, packed in crates, sold across borders. Some now sit in museums. Some were never seen again. But occasionally, the fragment reappears. A face in a junk shop, a pane behind a farmhouse wall, a burst of cobalt in a box of antiques. When this happens, scholars race to trace it, to find where it came from, to see what story it once belonged to reconnect the light to its origin. Because even a single shard can contain the soul of a century. There's a story, not confirmed, but often told, about a piece of glass found in a London antique stall in the 1950s. It was no bigger than a postcard, depicted a woman kneeling in blue dot. No name, no location, but on the back of the wood panel, someone had written in pencil, paid for by the last coins of a man who never returned. No one knows who, but that's the thing about stained glass. Even when we don't know the story, the light still tells it, and it continues today. Modern donors still give for stained glass, not just in cathedrals, but in hospitals, chapels, schools, memorial gardens. Some panels commemorate lost firefighters. Others celebrate births. Some depict nebulae, TNA strands, or peace doves. And still, the rule remains. Every window has a purpose. Every gift is a message. And every beam of colored light that lands across your shoulder was once someone's act of belief in beauty, in memory, in something greater than themselves. So the next time you see stained glass, don't just look at it. Step into the light. Let it touch you. Let it tell you that someone once hoped for something better and gave their light away to prove it. Maybe the real miracle is not the saint in the glass, but the hand that placed them there, far from the grand cities and gold-leafed cathedrals, deep inside the forests of medieval Europe. There was a very different kind of glassmaker. No patronage, no saints, just trees and fire and sand. This was the world of forest glass, a green, heavy, bubbled kind of glass, made by men who lived close to the earth, who burned everything they could find, and who shaped color, not for glory, but for survival. It was not elegant, it was not prestigious, but it worked, and it still holds the sunlight. Centuries later, the process began with two things: trees and sand. The trees were everywhere, vast woodlands of beech, oak, pine, and ash. Glassmakers would chop them by the cartload, stack the wood into enormous kilns, and burn it slowly for days to make ash dust. This was not the ash you see in a fireplace. This was potash, potassium carbonate, the key ingredient that lowered the pH melting point of silica. More potash meant less fuel was needed to melt sand into glass. It was messy, hot, exhausting work, and that was only the beginning. The sand came next, not pure white coastal sand, like in Venice. No, this was local sand, often mixed with iron, clay, stone. It gave the glass a green or brown hue, sometimes cloudy, sometimes streaked, always imperfect, and always unique. Glassmakers built temporary huts in the woods, half-shelters made from wattle, timber, and thatch. They dug pits for furnaces, lined with clay and brick, and kept the fires going as long as wood lasted. They worked in shifts. They slept near the smoke. They rarely stayed in one place for long. When the forest was exhausted, they moved, packed their molds, their blowpipes, their scorched crucibles, and started again. They were nomads of fire. The glass they made was simple. TANKARDS. Window. Panes, beads, storage jars. Heavy, practical, unpolished. You can still find pieces of it buried in fields. Green shards with tiny air bubbles frozen inside, like little breaths held for centuries. No saints painted on these windows. No miracle stories. Just glass for farmhouses and market stalls. Glass that didn't need to shine in cathedrals, only to survive a winter. Still, Kitha was skilled. Forest glassmakers knew how to twist molten blobs into wide-mouthed jugs, how to roll flat sheets with iron rods, how to mold thick rings called bullions, those central circles you sometimes see in old windows where the glass was spun and cut from a crown. They knew how to color without meaning to. Too much ash, a deep olive green dot. Too much iron, smoky gray. Occasional lime from burned bones. Amber. Each fire told its own story. Each batch was a conversation between wood, wind, and sand. In some regions, these glassworks became semi-permanent. Germany's Black Forest, France's Lorraine, Bohemia's Highlands. Families set up shop for decades, training apprentices, building better furnaces, even experimenting with added materials like wood, fern, ash. which gave an especially smooth melt. It was here that the phrase "Wald-Glas forest glass" became known, and it was respected, not for beauty, but for reliability. Ironically, the very impurity of forest glass gave it strength. It was thicker than CD glass, more forgiving. You could drop a forest-made tankard, and it might not break. That mattered to farmers, soldiers, merchants. They didn't need perfection. They needed utility, and forest glass delivered. But forest glass came with cost. Deforestation. A single glass hut could consume acres of timber per year. Wood was not only used to make potash, but 2 heat furnaces, which had to burn for weeks non-stop to keep the melt alive. As forests thinned, local lords grew wary. Some banned mobile glassmakers from settling near estates. Others taxed wood directly, charging fees for every felled tree. Still, the glassmakers moved quietly, cautiously to the next forest. They left behind ash pits, charcoal mounds, cracked crucibles, and memories in green glass. Sometimes local peasants believed the glassmakers were sorcerers. They arrived in the night, built strange fires, melted, rocked into liquid war leather aprons, and spoke in unfamiliar dialects. Left before anyone really knew their names, and what they left behind glittered in the dirt. Like dragon scales, forest magic of a very earthly kind. Over time, forest glass evolved. Some workshops grew roots, built stone furnaces, opened trade links, sold to monasteries, town councils, even the occasional nobleman. A few forest glaziers became wealthy, not like Venetian masters, but comfortable. Still, others passed on their craft quietly, from father to son, through gestures more than words. This fire is too soft. This ash is too bright. This sheet will shatter. They didn't write recipes. They just remembered. Until one day, they didn't, and the forest swallowed their story. But pieces remain. Green shards in plowed fields, bullion windows in old barns, tankards in folk museums. Evidence that even the humblest glass, thick, bubbly, uneven, still has something to say. That you don't need saints, halos, to deserve a place in history. Sometimes all it takes is sand, wood, and a little warmth. Maybe forest glass wasn't forgotten. Maybe it was just waiting to be noticed again in the way the sunlight still glints off green glass in the grass. The forest was never quiet, even when the wind was still. The trees creaked, the coals hissed, and somewhere in the distance, wolves howled. Glassmakers in the woods lived with these sounds. They didn't find them frightening. They found them familiar. The hiss of ash meant the furnace was alive. The crack of frozen wood splitting meant fuel for tomorrow. And a howl. That just meant the wild still remembered they were visitors. Forest furnaces were not like the grand kilns of Venice. They were low, built into pits or stone-lined mounds. The best ones were dug into gentle slopes, allowing cold air to enter from below and smoke to exit high above. They burned day and night. The apprentices slept beside them. Wrapped in wool, their skin always smudged with soot. No white cloth stayed white for long. The forest crept into everything, breath, clothes, lungs, and yet the work continued, because once the fire was hot enough to melt sand, you didn't let it die, not for anything, when ash production went wrong. The consequences were immediate. If the potash was overcooked, the glass would be brittle. If it was undercooked, the melt would never happen. Worse still, if the wood used had too much moisture, it produced smoke that contaminated the melt, leaving foggy streaks in the final sheets. This taught precision, not in numbers, but in instincts. Glassmakers learned to read smoke by color, by speed, by smell. They knew the difference between ash that hissed and ash that sighed. They developed a kind of forest chemistry, not taught in universities, but passed down with burned hands and tired eyes. Some experiments were intentional. A few glaziers tried combining different woods. Ash wood for base temperature, beech for long burns, fern ash for color tone. One region, in what is now southern Germany, even tried using dried manure as part of the ash blend. It worked, but left a smell no one could forget. Even the windows, once installed, gave off a strange odor when warmed by sunlight. The experiment was not repeated, but others were. Glassmakers discovered that adding limestone to the melt improved durability, crushed shells, burned bones, even powdered chalk scraped from local cliffs. This added calcium, reducing weather damage in the final panes. It also subtly shifted color. One forest workshop noticed that snail shells produced a clearer finish than cow bones. Another discovered that mixing lime into just one part of the crucible created gradients of color across a single pane. It was accidental innovation, one that modern science would later confirm. But they didn't need microscopes, just eyes and patience. Some of the most creative work came from waste. Broken crucibles were crushed, and added to new melts, a primitive form of recycling. Old shards were reheated. REMIXED. Even charcoal dust swept from furnace floors sometimes found its way into black glass batches used for bottles and jugs that didn't need to be pretty, strong. These waste melts had unpredictable salts, sometimes a rich brown, sometimes a smoky green -black dot. Once, a pane that shimmered purple when the sun hit it just right. No one could repeat it, but they kept the shard pinned to a wall above the furnace like a lucky charm. Forest glassmakers were not isolated from the world. Merchants came, traders passed, even monks wandered through, sometimes requesting cheap windows for a side chapel or a monastery kitchen. Some brought news of war, of peace, of cathedrals rising far away. Some brought gifts, a new tool, a strange powder, a rumor about red glass in Spain. And so, slowly, the forest glassmakers adapted by the late Middle Ages. Some forest workshops had proper names. They had ledgers, they had patrons, not rich ones, farmers who returned every year for storage jars. Tavern owners who bought tankards by the dozen, even abbots who quietly ordered glass for cloister windows, knowing full well it came from smoke-stained men in the woods. And the glass itself, it improved, smoother surfaces, fewer bubbles, better shape control, but it never lost its character. You could still spot a forest-made window from across a room. Its gentle ripple, its olive green hue, its slightly uneven cut. It didn't pretend to be Venetian. It was proud to be woodland, born, and yet couldn't last forever. The forest grew thinner. The laws tightened. Kings demanded taxes. Guilds from cities tried to outlaw mobile glassmakers, calling them uncivilized and wasteful. Some forest workshops were absorbed into regional trade networks. Others faded, but the legacy remained in technique, in texture, and in the glass itself. Today, forest glass survives in the quiet corners of Europe, in countryside churches, in barn windows, in museum drawers, in fields unearthed by plows. Every shard tells a story not of saints or kings, but of fire, ash, bark, and breath, of men who make color in the woods, with no audience, with no fame, only the joy of turning waste into wonder. There is a pane of glass in a small German chapel, no larger than a hand, cloudy, green, and rough. Most visitors pass by it. It has no saints, no stories, but when the sun strikes it in late afternoon, it glows like moss in spring, and for a moment you can almost hear the forest breathing. Maybe that's the gift forest glass left behind. Not just light, but the memory of fire in a forgotten place. It begins with silence, not the silence of a chapel, but the silence of tree stumps, of moss on old bricks, of a path, of remembered, leading nowhere. Once, This clearing had been alive with fire, smoke curling upward, glass glowing in clay pots, men shouting over the roar of flame. Now, just bird song, but the ground still knows. Dig deep enough, and you'll find blackened soil, a shard, a ring of stone, proof that once the forest burned, not with destruction, but with creation. Long after the glassmakers left, traces remained. Glass is stubborn. It doesn't rot. It doesn't crumble like parchment or peel like paint. It rests quietly, waiting. Farmers plowing fields would find thick green shards, edge-rounded, smooth, sometimes still sharp. Children pocketed them, called them dragon glass. Some thought they were jewels. They were closer to time capsules in a few rare places. Entire forest glassworks were uncovered by archaeologists. One in Germany revealed a buried furnace, half collapsed, but still holding fragments of raw sand and melted ash. Crucibles fused to the base, tools rusted into shape, charcoal stacked as if someone would return for it, and, most haunting of all, a wall still bearing the black scorch where the flame had licked it. For years, it was not a ruin. It was a snapshot of heat, of hands, of a world that did not seek to be remembered, but was, anyway, in France. A forest path leads to a forgotten glassmaker's hut, just a ring of stone. But near it, a spring. Local folklore says the water still smells faintly of smoke. People bring bottles, hoping for luck. They don't know who lived there, but the earth does, and the glass does, because scattered around the clearing are green bits of light, some flat, some curled, some with the telltale center bubble of hand-blown work. Each one is a story with no words, but full of meaning. Some museums now display forest glass as vernacular material culture. That's the technical term, but really it means this: ordinary beauty made by extraordinary hands in forgotten places. Forest glass was never meant to last. It wasn't carved in marble or painted by masters. It wasn't wrapped in velvet or passed through royal hands. It sat in kitchen shelves. It rattled in carts. It lined windows that rattled in the wind. And yet, it survived. More than survive, it remained because it was strong and because it was made not for glory, but for need. The irony. Today, forest glass is prized to collectors seek it out. Historians study its formula. Glassmakers try to replicate its green tone, often failing. That exact mix of potash, wood, ash, humidity, wind, and luck can't be written down. It was environmental, it was lived, it was one generation's constant improvisation, never recorded, only repeated, and once they stopped repeating, it vanished, except in the glass in one reconstructed forest hut in the Netherlands. Artisans now demonstrate medieval methods. They burn beech, they melt sand, they stir with iron rods and sleep on straw. Visitors watch, pressed. Children gasp when the molten blob turns into a bowl. They ask how it was done, and the master smiles. No exact way, he says, just the old way, and turns back to the fire. Because even today, forest glass isn't about showing off, it's about showing up. And perhaps that's what forest glass teaches us, that not all heritage is gilded. Some of it is green, some of it is chipped, some of it is made with hands that never wrote their names, but it exists. And when the light shines through it, crooked, thick, soft, it tells us not of kings or saints, but of people who worked until they got it right, who made windows in places no one expected and gave the world color. Without asking for thanks, there is one last tale. A pane of forest glass was found in the window of a chapel roof in Austria. Forgotten, dirty, partially covered with ivy. It had no pattern, no paint, no frame, just a disc, old, thick, with a curled ripple in the center. When conservators removed it for cleaning, they noticed something unusual. The glass bent the light in a perfect spiral as if the forest had left its signature. Today, it's displayed in a case. No plaque, no story, just a shaft of sunlight above it, letting the ripple return. So next time you see old green glass in a barn window, a museum shelf, or beneath the dirt of a plowed field, take a moment, hold it to the light, and remember, this was once fire, this was once breath, this was once enough. Maybe not all history is meant to shine like gold. Some of it glows softly, like glass, warmed by the hands of those who never asked to be remembered, but are. In most crafts, stakes are hidden. A cracked pot is tossed. A crooked stitch is unpicked. A sour note is never recorded. But in medieval glassmaking, some mistakes stayed, and some of those became masterpieces, because glass doesn't lie. Once melted, once shaped, once cooled, it's permanent. So when an error occurred mid-fire, there was no undoing it. And sometimes that's where the magic happened. It might start with the crucible, a crack in the ceramic, a drip of iron from the tools, a bit of soot from wet wood, anything, okay? Even the smallest trace could shift the color of the entire melt. Green turned to brown, clear turned to cloudy yellow, took on a strange pink hue, and the glassmakers would stare at it, puzzled. Sometimes they cursed, sometimes they laughed, but sometimes they leaned in. One famous case, the birth of flashed glass. A glassmaker, trying to make clear panes, accidentally poured a pot of red-colored molten glass over an older sheet that hadn't fully cooled. The result? Thin outer layer of ruby red, fused with a clear base. It wasn't uniform. It had swirls, veins, blotches, but when held to the light, it glowed. Later, artists learned how to recreate this flash on purpose by layering two thin colors together and etching one away to create patterns. But it all started from a furnace slip. One mistake, one miracle. Then there was the issue of metal contamination. Cobalt made blue, copper made green, gold made ruby. But what if the ingredients weren't pure? A batch of copper containing traces of silver could cause a shimmery turquoise. An iron rod, dipped too long, could dull a pot's entire clarity. Sometimes glazers discovered these effects days later, only when the installed windows reacted to sunlight differently than expected. One 3rd century church in Spain reported that its new south transept window burned like the sea. No one knew why, but they kept it. Glassmakers began embracing the chaos, not recklessly, but with curiosity. They started blending ashes from different woods, adding odd minerals found near RIVERBE, Dest 1 workshop. Even added one soaked charcoal, by mistake, resulting in a smoky lilac hue no one could replicate. In England, a batch of green glass turned brown when a local boy used lake water in the mix. The lake, it turned out, was rich in sulfur and peat. They named the result bog glass, sold it for half price. Monks loved it, said it reminded them of the earth. Sometimes beauty didn't need perfection, it just needed presence. There were also heat errors. If the furnace ran too hot, the glass scorched, turning brittle, warping. During shaping, too cold, and it clumped, full of bubbles. But just occasionally, a borderline fire would cause feathering, swirling cloud-like patterns where the ingredients didn't fully mix. These weren't intended, but when sliced into panels, they resembled clouds, smoke, halos. Some glaziers pretended they meant to do it. Others admitted, years later, it was just luck. Still, the effect remained, and future glassmakers learned to flirt with that threshold, hoping for another happy accident. And then there was weather. Rainy. Seasons changed everything. Wood, wetter, air was heavier. Humidity altered. How quickly a molten sheet cooled. In one Italian village, an entire month's batch of window panes came out foggy, not white, but hazy, as if trapped behind mist. They almost scrapped the shipment, but a priest insisted it looked spiritual. He said, God prefers mystery. The windows were installed. They are still there, foggy, ghost-like, perfect. Some mistakes became techniques. Once glazers realized that reheating semi-cooled sheets gave them ripple textures, they did it more often on purpose. Other times, they scraped imperfect paint off with horsehair brushes, revealing partial images that looked shadowed. An early form of shading. It was trial, it was error, it was art born of limits, and sometimes of exhaustion. One tired apprentice, too slow to finish a sheet, let it slump on the edge of the cooling rack. It bent, curved, rippled. When it cooled, it looked like flowing water. That apprentice was scolded, but the master, he saved the piece. Maybe the river has a place in the church, he said. Today, conservators try to explain these quirks scientifically. They measure calcium ratios, run spectrometry, test, trace pigment sources. But even with all the data, they admit some of the most beautiful pieces, unrepeatable, because they weren't designed. They were discovered. They were glass that happened. A conversation between heat, time, and chance. A shard found in a German cathedral wall bears 3 colors. Green at the bottom, red in the middle, K, and pale gold near the top. Tests showed the glass had been tilted during cooling. Gravity had pulled minerals through the sheet in slow motion. The window was never finished, never installed. But the shard, it's framed now, displayed with a plaque that reads, Unknown hand, unknown formula, unknown miracle. So much of medieval glass survives not because it was perfect, because someone once looked at it and said, yes, that's enough. Maybe that's the most human kind of beauty, the kind born by mistake, the kind that surprises, the kind that glows without explanation. Maybe not all colors were chosen. Some were gifted. There's a curious paradox in medieval glasswork. The more control they thought they had, the more often things went wrong, and the less they tried to control, the more beauty appeared. By the 14th century, master glassmakers had learned to embrace this. They didn't call it chaos, they called it character. A streak was not a flaw, it was motion. A bubble wasn't failure, it was breath. And color, especially unexpected color, was no longer just tolerated, it was invited. Consider the case of silver stain. It began not with molten glass, but with post-firing decoration. Artisans painted designs on the back of a pane using a compound containing silver nitrate, hoping for a soft shimmer. But what they got was yellow rich, buttery, glowing yellow, wherever the brush had touched. The glass turned golden after firing. This was an accident, a chemical surprise, but it changed everything suddenly. Glazers had access to a new color that didn't require a full melt. They used it for halos, for sunbeams, for crowns, for wheat fields. And just like that, a slip of chemistry became a whole visual language. Other times, the accident wasn't in the glass, it was in the light. A pane installed facing east, meant for soft morning light, was mistakenly placed in the west window. No one noticed until evening. Then the setting sun hit it like fire. The figures in the glass, once dull, ignited in crimson and copper. The effect was unplanned, but so breathtaking that pilgrims returned each dusk just to see it. Eventually, churches copied the mistake. They rotated their layouts to catch the golden hour, all because someone once labeled a crate incorrectly. Texture also offered surprises. Sometimes, when molten sheets cooled too quickly, the surface wrinkled. It was called devil glass, warped, unpredictable, prone to snapping under pressure. But artists found it useful. The ripples created shadows, depth, in otherwise flat windows, used in cloaks. It suggested movement, used in clouds. It mimicked real sky, used in halos. It danced like flame. No one could reproduce it exactly, but every workshop tried, and the devil, once feared, became divine. Even cracks found their way into the art. A pane cracked during transport. The church couldn't afford a new one, so the glazier added extra lead cames to hold the pieces together. The result, zigzagging line across a saint's robe. Strangely beautiful. Years later, artists began adding similar lines, intentionally mimicking fractures as part of the design. It added age, mystery, narrative. A saint, not pristine, but enduring. A robe, not perfect, but worn. Sometimes, the illusion of damage gave a window more soul. In one abbey, a batch of paint ran during firing. The saint's face looked like it was weeping. The monks wept, too, but not out of disappointment. They believed it was a sign, a miracle. The saint shared their sorrow. The window remained, and pilgrims knelt before it for generations, whispering their grief into the glass. Some accidents became seasonal in cold winters. Furnaces behaved differently. Glass cooled faster. Colors separated more dramatically. You'd get marbled panes, red and white, swirling like candle wax in hot summers. The melt was sluggish. Some coppers oxidized unevenly, giving a bronze finish that shimmered in shadow. Artisans began planning around the seasons. Let's make blue in spring. Red behaves better in snow. They didn't control the world. They danced with it, and in that dance, creation thrived. Sometimes, accidents preserved history. One panel rushed to meet a bishop's visit. Was overfired. The paint faded. The outlines blurred, but underneath the original sketch, drawn in charcoal before painting, remained visible. Centuries later, historians used that panel to understand medieval planning techniques. A mistake became a time machine. A ruined window became the most valuable one in the chapel, and occasionally an error told a joke. A small window in a side corridor of a monastery shows a monk carrying a fish, but the glassmaker misaligned the panels. The fish hovers in midair. For decades, no one fixed it today. It's famous. Visitors take photos. The caption underneath reads, "Miracle of the Flying Fish." Sometimes history isn't serious. Sometimes it laughs, and sometimes a mistake becomes the memory. Modern artisans often say, we aim for precision, but we honor surprise, because surprise, after all, is how new things enter the world. And medieval glass, for all its ritual and reverence, was full of surprise. A color from a wrong mix, a shape from a tired hand, a glow from an unexpected angle. Maybe the window wasn't broken. Maybe it was just telling a better story. The beauty of stained glass is that it's made for light, not for museums, not for vaults, not for perfection. Glass is meant to glow, and glow it did, even when things went wrong, especially when things went wrong, because the greatest legacy of accidental medieval glass was not the technique, it was the attitude to accept what the fire gave, to listen to the heat, to stop demanding control, and to learn, instead, how to see. By the 15th century, workshops across Europe had stopped pretending that every batch would be identical. They welcomed the unexpected. Some even added steps to encourage variation. Instead of carefully filtered ash, they mixed in fragments of old melted windows. Instead of clean water, they experimented with well water, rich in iron or sulfur or lime. Instead of rejecting flawed panes, they built entire windows around them. A cracked disc became a moon. A bent sheet became a falling. ROBEA stained border became fire. What had once been error became inspiration. Word count: 301. French workshop, famous for its deep crimson glass, once tried a new crucible. It was thinner, fired at a lower temperature. During the melt, the pot warped and the color shifted. The result? Red, with violet undertones. So unusual, it didn't match anything else in the cathedral. The panel was meant to be part of a larger passion scene, but when installed, it stood out like a bruise. The glazier apologized. The abbot paused, then said, "It suits the sorrow." That flawed pane became the centerpiece. It's still there, slightly off, slightly wrong, utterly unforgettable. In another case, a small church in Bohemia commissioned windows showing the four seasons, but the winter pane cooled too quickly. The blue fractured. Spiderweb cracks across the surface. Everyone assumed it was ruined, until a child walked past and gasped, "It looks like frost." And it did. The window stayed. The artist's signature, a single snowflake etched into the corner, proof that mistakes, like seasons, could be beautiful. Sometimes, even glass aging became art as minerals migrated. Sunlight warped colors. Red dulled into rust. Blue shifted toward gray. Some glass turned cloudy, some translucent, but churches didn't replace them. They called it patina, the mark of time, a reminder that glass lives, that it remembers. The layering technique of flashed glass. Once an accident grew into full-on experimentation. Glaziers would intentionally overlay red and blue, then etch away patterns to let light through. Sometimes they scraped too much, sometimes not enough. Sometimes they used broken tools, left ragged lines. Those ragged lines became a style. Later, they'd be called grisaille, but originally, they were just scratches, like shadows left behind by indecision, like whispers of doubt that made the image feel more real. Even the placement of glass mattered. Some windows, when rotated slightly, even by an inch, caught the sun differently. Refractions changed colors, danced by mistake in one northern chapel. A window meant for the east wall was installed in the south. The result? Each solstice, at a certain angle, a burst of rainbow light hit the altar. The window wasn't moved. The priest simply smiled and said, "Let the light decide." Aesthetics born from error weren't unique to cathedrals. Village, churches, tavern, windows, merchant homes, all had their own versions. A tavern in Ghent displayed a warped window with a green tint, uneven, rippled, and misshapen. But every evening, as the sun set, it cast a strange glow across the wooden bar. Locals called it the ghost glass. When the tavern burned down years later, they salvaged that window, framed it, hung it in the rebuilt wall. It didn't fit the space. It didn't match the new design, but it belonged because it was part of the place's memory. Some mistakes had consequences. Unstable formulas caused panes to crumble. Decades later, paint peeled from overfired surfaces, but even this decay gained meaning. Some churches left decayed panels in place as memento mori, as proof that beauty fades, as visual sermons on impermanence. One priest preached weekly in front of a ghosted window. No image remains forever, he said, but the light behind it does. In modern restoration, conservators often face a dilemma. Do they fix a historical mistake or preserve it? A crooked lead line, a poorly mixed pigment, an accidental crack with emotional resonance. More and more, they choose to leave it because the flaws carry human touch, because the errors tell the story better than perfection could, and because, deep down, we recognize that what was once a mistake might now be the most honest part of the whole work. A museum in Austria once received a donation of mismatched, stained glass shards. Some were too warped to fit frames. Others had scorch marks, odd colors, strange curves. Curators almost declined until one noticed something tiled up to the light. The shards created an abstract scene, swirls of red, broken blue, fractured gold. It looked accidental. It was accidental, but it felt like a window into time. They arranged the shards in a new frame. No narrative, no saints, just chaos. caught in color. It's now one of their most popular exhibits. The label simply reads, "Beauty by Mistake." So perhaps the lesson of medieval glass is not in its pigments or its formulas, but in its forgiveness. It allowed for missteps, for miscalculations, for imperfection to become inheritance. Maybe that's why, centuries later, we still gaze at those windows, not because they're flawless, but because they're human. They remind us that the best art was never supposed to be, it just happened. And sometimes that's the most beautiful thing of all.